Hello, welcome, and thank you to all who are joining us online today. I am Juan, Dean of the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design. I'm delighted to welcome you to the book talk of Terra-Sorta-Firma, Reclaiming the Littoral Gradient. First, I would like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Speaking of land, this book, Terra-Sorta-Firma, is edited by our Daniels faculty member, Fadi Masood, along with collaborators and contributors from around the world, some of whom are joining us tonight to present the works, and we look forward to hearing from them as well. The book documents the global extent of reclaimed coastal lands and provides a framework for comparison and discussion across various geographies, cultures, and histories. For centuries, cities have grown and expanded into previously saturated grounds, reclaiming land from estuaries, marshes, mangroves, and seabeds. While these artificial coastlines are sites of tremendous real estate, civic, infrastructural, and cultural investments, they're also the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Now, I would like to welcome Fadi to introduce this very important book, the event, and our guest speakers. To you, Fadi.
Thank you so much, Dean Du. I am just gonna share my screen, if that's okay. Let me allow it here. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so thank you, Dean Juan. Welcome, everyone. I'm so thrilled to welcome you to the launch of the book, official launch of the book and book talk. I'm Fadi Masood, Assistant Professor of Landscape Architecture and Urbanism at the Daniels Faculty and the Director of the Center for Landscape Research here. I am super delighted to be joined tonight by a handful of incredible scholars and friends. Ben Mendelsohn, Assistant Professor of Film and Digital Culture at Portland State University. Xiao Xuan Lu, Assistant Professor in the Division of Landscape Architecture at the University of Hong Kong. Luna Khirfan, Associate Professor at the School of Planning at the University of Waterloo. Michael Wilson, Associate Policy Researcher at the RAND Corporation and a Registered Landscape Architect. I am really honored that the event will also be co-moderated by Brent Ryan, the Head of City Design and Development and Associate Professor of Urban Design and Public Policy at MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning, where this whole book project first got its start. Before I begin, I want to take a minute to also thank the many wonderful colleagues, staff, students, and researchers from across U of T, MIT, and ACTAR for the support of the book in tonight's event. Without them, none of this would be possible. I also wanted to give a quick disclaimer about a handful of spelling mistakes that appeared in the printed version of the book. In the height of the pandemic last winter, we ran into some copy editing and rushed to print gaffes. To that, I sincerely apologize, but I hope you will still find the book useful and enlightening despite of them. On a 5-kilometer stretch of artificial terrain at the edge of Canada's largest city lives North America's largest colony of double-crested cormorants, as well as thousands of plants, animals, and migrating bird species. On the rubble of Toronto subway tunnels, Mies van der Rohe's TD Tower foundations, and the demolition of Victorian-era slums is one of the Great Lakes' most significant ecological areas. Originally conceived as a breakwater for the ill-fated Port of Toronto, the Leslie Street Spit is representative of what has come to be known as the archaeosphere, and new strata at the intersection of archaeology, geology, and ecology. The archaeosphere, described by geologist Matthew Edgeworth, is the set of anthropologically modified deposits that now cover large parts of the Earth. It not only includes artificial terrain composed of the dirt and rubble moved by human activity, but also layers of the technosphere, cables, pipes, machinery, rebar, as well as living matter, bacteria, critters, plants, and roots. It is the surface environment where geology, biology, the atmosphere, and the sun's energy interacts. Over time, cities secreted and accumulated layers of material on top of which further growth, transformation, and development have taken place. The continuous shaping and reshaping of a new global coastal edge implores us to consider this archaeosphere, especially in the face of a climate emergency. Coastlines are naturally shaped over time through slow erosion and accretion. Today, we humans are the most significant agent of instant global scale geologic transformation. This book points to these massive land shifts, and as Adam Gradoy asserts in the book, reclamation is the most commonly used English language term for the construction of ground where water had been once, but it's in a sense inappropriate. Land reclamation does not typically reclaim lost ground at all, but instead extends solid ground onto new frontiers, a process that is far from the straightforward triumphs of material fixity. To accommodate fast rates of urban growth, many coastal cities continue to expand onto nearby waters, despite the ever-present threats of land subsidence, sea level rise, and ecological deterioration. Coastal land reclamation is not a modern phenomenon, but the pace, scale, and ubiquity is. In a recent article published by the quarterly magazine of the International Association of Dredging Companies, industry authors reflected on why nature-based solutions, or the integration of living systems with great infrastructures to form hybrids, do not yet represent a valid option for coastal flood defense. They noted that the evolution of nature-based solutions, I quote, implies an element of uncertainty. As such, existing traditional procurement methods, governance, and cost-benefit assessments are not suitable absent different types of guarantees. Guarantees that static permanence on the most dynamic thresholds of our planet is futile. In 2006, Waterfront Toronto hired New York City landscape architecture firm Field Operations to prepare a master plan that guides the future transformation of the Leslie Streets bit, redubbed Lake Ontario Park. The master plan embraced the ecological and structural complexity and richness of the site while supporting the implementation of projects that are already underway in the nearby Portlands. Taking cues from the intersectionality of ecology, geology, and recreation, the proposal's goal was to change the way we think about urban waterfronts. The book suggests that we understand and design the future of all urban waterfronts through a similar lens. The book's 4 parts sets up the stage to see the shaping of terrain as the very first act of design intervention. Part 1 discusses the politics and performance of creating artificial ground, especially through the lens of sand and its $70 billion a year global trade. 40 billion tons of sand a year goes into urban development. That's twice the amount of sediment carried by all the world's rivers combined. Seemingly infinite, water-weathered sand is the second most consumed natural resource on the planet after fresh water, and according to the United Nations, has now become a scarce resource. Dubai, for example, desert city, imports sand from Australia to build its towers on artificial islands. According to Forbes magazine, China alone consumed more sand to make concrete in 3 years as the US has in the last 100. So this section of the book documents the role of global conglomerates, mostly the Dutch and Chinese companies and their associated technologies as they profit from the shaping and reshaping of so much of our Earth. It includes diagrams that illustrates the various techniques and technologies involved in the process of land reclamation, including dredging, spatial dynamics, and shoreline management and protection. This first section also includes 2 essays by the New York Times contributor Vince Beiser and Dutch design office Atelier NL. They examine the patterns of global sand trade together with the distribution of human populations along coastlines and the availability and allocation of sand grain for human consumption. The second part composes the bulk of the book, and it includes a graphic atlas of 50+ case studies of urban districts built on reclaimed land. It showcases projects from a diverse global and historical perspective. It illustrates the transformation of coastlines and traces them back from their current condition to their original state. It is also to illustrate a global paradox that faces many coastal cities, where waterfronts continue to be prime real estate, but are also the most vulnerable places for flooding. The case studies in the atlas are organized under various subcategories. The first is the category of claiming territory, where projects are of regional, military, and political significance, aka nation-building endeavors. This includes the massive polders of the Netherlands, or the island city-state expansion of Singapore, where sand procurement is treated as a matter of national security. The second section, titled Geologic Necessity, highlights projects in cities that are limited by steep terrains, tidal marshes, or both. These urban districts emerged as a result of urban pressures in cities with immense geologic limitations. Examples include Hong Kong and Mumbai, the San Francisco Bay Area, New Orleans, and Mexico City. Projects in the flamboyant real estate section are developer-driven. They're speculative and instantaneous, promising economic riches on reclaimed land. This includes projects all around the Persian Gulf and the glitzy homes around Miami. Landscape brownfields are projects that deploy landscape and environmental design strategies for the transformation of post-industrial sites. This includes all the incredible work taking place on Toronto's waterfront, Olmsted's Back Bay Fens in Boston, and the transformation of Brooklyn's waterfront. The last category in the atlas is titled Blue Collar Brown Water, which includes Portland's and industrial brownfield sites that remain critical economic engines in global maritime trade. This includes the shorelines of Tokyo Bay, Osaka and Kobe, and the harbors of London, Los Angeles, Belfast, and Rotterdam. Part 3 of the book takes a closer look at land reclamation in one country in particular. China today is the globe's largest consumer of sand and has the largest land reclamation project in the world. To protect its limited arable land and relieve the pressure of urban growth, China has expanded out into the sea. The Chinese sub-atlas includes 21 projects representing major typologies of reclaimed land located in a variety of geopolitical contexts within China. Over the last 40 years, China reclaimed 13,000 square kilometers of land and expanded its coastline by almost 2,000 kilometers. This resulted in a reduction of 50% of China's coastal plains and wetlands. At some point, new artificial terrain was constructed at the rate of 700 square kilometers per year. The sub-atlas analyzes 21 case studies and through a series of matrices and indices that compared their condition and viability. I want you to note the Manhattan scale comparison for reference on the bottom right hand of your screen. The sub-atlas includes projects like Kaofeijian, the world's largest reclamation site, as well as Nanhui and Qianhai in Shenzhen, where we assessed the risks of liquefaction, erosion, and flooding on these sites. We also visited Jim Corner Field Operations Green Fingers in Qianhai Water City, the winning competition entry for a massive city built on reclaimed land in Shenzhen. This section of the book also includes a wonderful essay by Lu, who you will be hearing from very shortly. The final section of the book includes a selection of essays from 6 contributors, each tackling a different geography and topic. Adam Grado's essay takes us on a world tour to learn about the procurement and value of public open space on reclaimed land. He says that land reclamation has become a favorite strategy for developers because it's a means by which elite actors can create new urban spaces while bypassing many tensions that result from normative and complex urban developments. On the other side of the conversation, Professor Luna Khirfan and Hadi El-Shaib talk about the role of public participatory climate resilience planning, especially the reclamation of land from urban streams and rivers that have been culverted and diverted. Qian Go's chapter discusses the Singaporean eco-model, which has gained significant traction in the face of mounting global environmental crises. She discusses how the Singaporean state channeled its responses to geographic and political pressures through an urban environmental transformation. Her essay explores the expansionist outlook shared by Singapore's economic and environmental strategies through the concept of trans-territorial ecologies. Ben Mendelsohn, who we'll also hear from very shortly, takes us to Makoko, a sprawling water settlement in the shores of Lagos, and discusses its presence and pressures of the eco-Atlantic city development nearby. Mike will take us to Boston, where Boston's shifting ground, and sees it and his chapter offers Boston as a case study for the future pressures of cities in the Northeast as sea levels begin to rise. Lastly, my chapter at the end of the book offers a series of landscape-based adaptation and resilience strategies for urban transformation on reclaimed land. It does that by offering a brief comparative analysis of the Back Bay in Boston designed by Olmsted in 1878 and the Lower Downlands project designed by MVVA in 2006. Both are keystone waterfront districts built on reclaimed land and designed by the leading landscape architects of their time. Completed more than a century apart, these projects emerged as a result of design competitions with the aim of transforming derelict and flood-prone prime real estate areas by leading with landscape. Looking ahead at the Center for Landscape Research, we have been testing the use of generative design so we can deploy new cut and fill operations that are more responsive to live feed data such as currents, tides, waves, and salinity, and are optimized to decrease flood risk, land and increase land value and ecological performance. This means that we can potentially build coastal developments that are more responsive to gradients of inundation and water fluctuations, ones where novel building types, open spaces, and infrastructures are envisioned. And in doing so, a new type of urban transect emerges, one that dissolves the wet and dry binary and offers an expanded notion of what a reclaimed littoral zone could look like. I will end by quoting landscape scholar J.B. Jackson, whom I've quoted on this a few times because he astonishingly spoke about climate change to an audience of designers almost 50 years ago. He wisely observed that the beaches along the Gulf and the Atlantic are doomed to destruction. They are remorselessly eaten away by the sea. Geographers tell us that we are being driven inward by the rising ocean at the rate of 1 vertical foot a century. When asked about the future trajectory of design professions in a changing environment, he responded, "I believe that the natural environment cannot be saved in its present form because everything conspires against static permanence. And so we need to embrace change and uncertainty by designing for it." At the end, it's important to remember that in an age of extreme uncertainty, we should first break down our professional silos, then question the binaries of wet and dry, land and water, and dissolve them into gradients that are shaped and embraced by varying degrees of uncertainty. Thank you so much. I also want to urge you to please check out the digital interactive atlas at littoralgradients.daniels.utoronto.ca. I will now pass the mic over to Ben Mendelsohn.
Thanks so much, Sodhi. Thanks to Dean Du and the Daniels faculty for the invitation. Delighted to be here in the as a non-urbanist, as an urbanist, but a non-architect in the presence of architects. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my chapter and some additional context for the research that I've done in Lagos over the past several years, beginning in 2014, a few years after the Echo Atlantic project developed, and I began to think about dredging and sand filling in dialogue with the landscape architects of the Dredge Research Collaborative, who really kind of helped me to see sand filling as an urban infrastructure and a kind of critical urban analytic or hermeneutic. And it was tracing the global footprint of Royal Haskellene and other Dutch dredging firms that took me to Lagos in the first place, and kind of trying to get a sense of where these actors were operating. And that's how I learned of Echo Atlantic, and Echo Atlantic City became my window into understanding Lagos across the kind of past, present, and future. But I also want to emphasize some of the visual culture dynamics and the photography elements where my sort of current research is moving, as well as kind of what the chapter in this delightful and extremely helpful, comprehensive book is offering. So let me move things along. Yep, there's I'm an assistant professor of film and digital culture here at Portland State University. I did also want to offer a brief land acknowledgement of the land where I'm currently sitting, which stands on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala, bands of Chinook, and the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. And it is important to recognize that we live and work on these ancestral lands. So I will continue moving forward. So the chapter that is included in the book, the false binaries invoked in the title refer not only to the binary between wet and dry, or land and water, and an idea of sogginess, but is also invoking what I came to understand as the problems, the repetitions, and the kind of paucity of imagination in global climate journalism in particular that was visiting Lagos and studying the Eco-Atlantic site. And what really I think became a problem was the ways in which Eco-Atlantic City, as an example of this flamboyant real estate, as the chapter refers to it, or as an example of the types of solutions being sold by a global, by dredging industry and property developers, was frequently being contrasted to Makoko, an amphibious informal settlement and site of architectural intervention and urbanist interest. And this had kind of come to stand into the only two possibilities and the only two modes of land making, earth moving, and kind of occupying the littoral gradient, dwelling and making life within the sogginess and wateriness of the city. So while my chapter does kind of dig in some amount of depth to each of the sites, it's really doing so in order to kind of propose that other analytic paradigms, other narrative paradigms are kind of necessary to properly interpret the situatedness of earth moving, land making, the relationships of land, sand, and water in Lagos. So this is an aerial view of Eco-Atlantic City from 2016. This is a kind of explanatory diagram that gives the backstory for why it was pursued in the first place, as a financing mechanism for building a seawall to respond to the erosion that resulted from early 20th century British harbor works that trapped sand in their western mole, while sand eroded along the iconic and also high-valued waterfront area of Victoria Island. And a number of replenishment strategies were pursued over the years, but none ever stuck until this proposal kind of took shape in the early 2000s and broke ground, I believe around 2009. I think it's also really important to situate Lagos here in the Bight of Benin, and as a lagoon, sort of barrier island lagoon complex in the center of two massive river deltas. Towards the left of the image, the Volta River Delta. So you're seeing the results of the Akosombo Dam. And towards the right, the Niger River Delta, what is described as at one time one of the longest, if not the longest, uninterrupted stretches of littoral drift in the world. And what's fascinating is that in sort of the prior to European arrival, this stretch of coast was almost entirely navigable by canoes of interior lagoons with minimal portage. So just as a kind of the scale of historic transformation of the ecology here in the coastal drift system, I think is just a really important background and context for interpreting what something like Eco-Atlantic represents, as not the ultimate final arrival of urban modernity as the developers kind of propose or promise, but as just one more episode in a long ongoing history of coastal interventions and attempts at kind of hardening or regulating the sedimentary dynamics of the region. So what's often in these narratives counterposed to Eco-Atlantic is Makoko, and for a time it was the Makoko Floating School, proposed and built by the architect Kunle Adeyemi, which I'm sure many, if not all of you, are familiar with, read about, perhaps were deeply inspired by until it's, here's a rendering that Adeyemi did for the MoMA Tactical Urbanisms exhibition in 2015, multiplying that paradigm to the sort of city scale until it collapsed in 2016. And under conditions that he claimed were always intentional. The reporting at the time kind of indicated it was never fully operative. All of the school children depicted in pictures were actually staged and posed. Fadi, how am I doing for time? How much longer I got?
5 more minutes, I think.
5 more minutes?
Yeah.
So the chapter in the book kind of responds to the way that these two sites are presented as kind of the two main possibilities and the two main ways of available modes of thinking about coastal habitation, about occupying the land water divide on the one hand, the instant hypermodernity of the planned city on reclaimed land with the suite of international collaborators on the other, this fantasy of a Afrocentric indigenous sourced architecture that responds to the needs of a local community with sensitivity, as well as an embrace of sort of some degree of architectural modernity. It's another aspect of the larger research that I've done is kind of to emphasize the degree to which contemporary visual artists, documentary photographers, Nigerian documentary photographers have been deeply kind of embedded in producing the visual counterpoints to these narratives. So these are images of the floating logs. So Makoko is a site of regional timber trade, source for a lot of the dwellings. Also, the sawdust and burnt scraps become an additional source of fill, a kind of simulated sand or alt sand in this environment. Just kind of scrolling through some pictures briefly. But what I'd really want to emphasize and close with, so the artist George Sodhi, who has done a lot of photography of Echo Atlantic. So here's an exhibition that he had at a gallery in Lagos, based on some of his commissioned Getty Images photographs of the land reclamation site under development, along with historic photographs of the Bar Beach site, the site that existed prior to the Echo Atlantic development. And when I spent time with George Sodhi, I was really struck to learn that he was actually a local chairperson of his own development along the southern stretch of the lagoon, of Lagos Lagoon, where he had sand filled for his own house and was in the process of sand filling an art gallery, and was just really kind of living in and occupying the landscape that he was also under, also in the middle of experiencing. And what this really drove home for me was that rather than the interpretive framework of thinking the kind of ultra rich or the urban poor, that there was an enormous spectrum of land making strategies across all income levels within the city. What I think we can understand is a widespread language of life to draw on Achille Mbembe. And this is just a quote that he offered when I, kind of asked him about his interest in land reclamation, his interest in sand, the sense that it's something that he documents, from Echo Atlantic to independent sand miners working in the lagoon. And his response was, people need space, but Lagos doesn't have that space because it's water. So the most you can do, use the ability you have to reclaim as much as you can in your own way. Everybody does reclamation. I'm living in water. This place was swamp, but we filled it with sand. And right now I'm buying the sand for next door. So everyone in Lagos has to, one way or the other, make land one way or the other somehow. So I will leave it there. And thanks so much for your time and for the invitation, and look forward to the further discussion.
Now pass the mic over to Lou.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again. Thank you, Fadi, for the invitation. Let me share my screen. Okay. So in this brief talk, I think I'll just offer a glimpse of this chapter I contribute to the book, which is called China and Her Return to the Ocean. So in the summer of 2013, I drove from Beijing to Tianjin to photograph coast fish farms and salt pans. As I headed south along the coast of National Expressway number 1, the urban cityscape dissolved into a wide rural landscape. According to Google Map, there were fish ponds all along the northwest side of the road, and the coastline of Bohai Bay along the southeast side. However, the reality was I was surrounded by miles of open wasteland. I pressed forward until I spotted a number of construction cranes being used to install pipelines across the wasteland, and brand new roads stretched out towards the sea. According to Google Map, I was already 1 kilometer out to sea in Bohai Bay. In fact, I was standing on so-called reclaimed land, or new territories, not yet shown on the 2010 satellite map. The barren landscape changed as I continued along one of the roads stretching towards the ocean. At first, it was covered with drifts of red-leaved shrubs, which gradually thinned out as I proceeded, revealing alternate dry and waterlogged patches of ground. After a while, the asphalt road surface gave way to dirt causeway flanked by mudflats, serenaded by a multitude of water pumps, gurgling and bumbling, as if in celebration of the birth of a new area of land. It was only when Google Maps informed me I was 10 kilometers away from the 2010 coastline that I caught sight of Bohai Bay on the horizon. Rows of temporary steel pipes littered the outer edge of the new land. Endless processions of the barges trucked by as if bringing reinforcements to the battlefront between land and sea. In his 13 poems on reading the classic of mountains and seas, Chinese poet Tao Yuanming wrote, "Jingwei carries twigs in her mouth to fill up the vast sea." So in Chinese mythology, Jingwei is a bird who was transformed from the goddess Nuwa after she drowned when playing in the Eastern Sea. As a result, Jingwei is determined to fill the Eastern Sea with twigs and pebbles to prevent other tragedies from happening. So today, instead of the twigs that Jingwei carried in her mouth, sand and stone are the materials used to fill the sea and expand China's 18,000 kilometers coastline, where reclamation on a massive scale is proceeding at an unprecedented rate. So in this chapter titled China and Her Return to the Ocean, I focus on China's perception and management of its marine frontier as reviewed by maps, documents, and policies. So this chapter compares two critical cartographical surveys drawn up 2 centuries apart, namely the coastal map of the 7 provinces, or Yanhaitu, of the late 19th century, and the Special Project 908 of the early 21st century. So the detailed examination of Yanhaitu in this chapter challenged the dominant narrative that China is an inward-looking, land-based power. So in the Western discourse, China has consistently been considered a land-based continental power with a lack of maritime engagement, despite its 18,000 kilometers coastline. This is part of a wider narrative claiming that the violations of Great Britain and other European powers, such as the Opium Wars of the 19th century, were a long overdue wake-up call for a land-focused empire reluctant to embrace the opportunities of the wider world beyond its neglected coastlines. In fact, China has considered both its maritime frontier and its land frontier of equal strategic importance since early imperial times. And China's perception and management of its maritime space throughout history need to be considered in the context of many other themes, ranging from the daily life of farming and fishing to trade, travel, diplomacy, and military priorities. So China has always made use of its marine resources in addition to land-based agriculture, as illustrated by the ever-changing reinterpretations of the Chinese phrase, 以天为海, literally means the sea as arable fields. So before the late 16th century, the phrase was mainly used to describe the equal importance of sea and land from the point of view of food production, referring sometimes to reclaiming land from the sea directly to expand arable fields, and sometimes to exploiting marine resources to substitute for or supplement the agricultural products. So the latter included raising and gathering marine plant and seafood along the shoreline, fishing on the high seas, and above all, extracting salt from salt pans. As China's maritime trade expanded in the 16th century, the meaning of 以天为海 became more complex as it increasingly took on a mercantile connotation. So after a government ban on maritime trade was imposed, in an effort to eradicate increasing piracy along China's coast, officials representing coast regions used 以天为海 and its variation 以海为生 literally means making a living on the sea, to persuade the imperial court to relax the ban. And later in the 17th century, after the Qing dynasty took over China proper in 1644, the usage of 以天为海 or 以海为天 started to lose its mercantile connotation. Instead, this phrase referred to not only the exploitation of marine resources, resumption of the traditional analogy between the farmland and the sea, but also to the politicization of the maritime frontier. So with the emergence of a more modern concept of sovereignties in Qing China, Yihai Weitian came to imply that marine resources and littoral territories could be mapped and taxed just like the arable ones. So the Qing rulers and scholars, they sought to project the all-encompassing gaze of the empire onto both the terrestrial and the maritime domains in an effort to precisely define all areas under the control of the state. So indeed, the projection of the state power over the ambiguous littoral territory composed of islands, inlets, cliffs, rocks, and reefs was critical for preventing real and perceived threats to the legitimacy of the imperial rule. So while geographical knowledge, mapping, and documentation of China's maritime space already had a long history well before the 17th century, increasingly advanced geographical knowledge and cartographical techniques enabled Qing China to map its maritime environs at an unprecedented scale. So an optimal example of examining this unique characteristic of Qing coastal maps is the charting of the Qing maritime frontier in the coastal map of the 7 provinces or Yinhai-2. In contrast to the previous maritime atlases, where most littoral fade into the unknown, the maritime frontier in the Qing Empire is clearly documented in the Yinhai-2, with most of the river mouths, harbors, and islands identified on this map. Moreover, considering the level of details included in this map, Yinhai-2 is one of the first coastal maps that depicted China's maritime frontier horizontally instead of vertically, with the coastal landmass in the upper half of the map and the vast body of water in the lower half of the map. So depicting contours of the coastal regions and the immediate sea space under the control of the Qing Empire, the map reflects the intense attention that administrators, merchants, and intellectuals paid to the coastal seawaters and the littoral knowledge they possessed. So the Yinhai-2 was drawn up in the late 18th century under the auspices of Qing imperial court, which realized it urgently need a thorough overview of the entire maritime frontier to manage the coastal issues, as the previous books and maps were seen as not up to date. And 2 centuries later, in September 2003, the State Council of the People's Republic of China approved the Special Project 908, a comprehensive survey and assessment of all Chinese claimed maritime space in the near seas. So the juxtapositions of Yinhai-2 and Project 908 in this chapter reveals how the significance of China's maritime frontier gradually shifts from the territorial to economic, embodying a whole new set of national geographical priorities. So a detailed examination of Project 908 in this chapter positions China's unprecedented surge of land reclamation over the past 2 decades within the context of an ongoing shift of national attention towards the ocean. So China has reclaimed 13,000 square kilometers of land and has expanded its coastline by approximately 2,000 kilometers since the People's Republic was founded in 1949. The fact that the lion's share of this expansion has occurred since the dawn of this millennium is of particular interest. So an unprecedented surge of officially confirmed land reclamation was recorded between 2003 and 2005, and this high growth rate has been sustained up to this day. And this unprecedented freezing of land reclamation in China since 2003 is double the total area reclaimed in the entire second half of the 20th century. so that the pace and scale of land reclamation after 2002 dwarfs that of any other nations is not accident. So the phenomenon precisely correlates with China's launching of political agenda in late 2002, calling the 21st century the ocean century or 海洋世纪, and proposing to make China a great sea power or 海洋强国. So Project 908 was launched within such context, and a special project committee was established. The project took 8 years to complete and was carried out in 3 phases between 2004 and 2011, and over 30,000 scientists and technicians from more than 180 maritime-related institutions nationwide, they worked on this project, sailing more than 500 survey vessels, 2 million kilometers over a total of 20,000 offshore operation days. So Project 908 is a critical national project which aimed to collect and disseminate data about China's littoral regions in order to improve the country's ocean management capabilities. So as stated in the general principle of Special Project 908, there is a need for maritime development to shift from a traditional model that focused just on shipping, fishing, and salting to a modern one emphasizing the scaling up of marine industry development. So Chinese government official and academic terminology, they often refer to the country's ocean area as Blue National Territory or 蓝色国土, while the marine economy is called the Blue Economy or 蓝色经济. So of the 12 major marine industrial sectors defined by the National Standard Management Committee, land reclamation is closely associated with maritime communications and transportation, coastal tourism, and marine engineering construction. Indeed, these 3 sectors account for 79.3% of China's total GOP, according to the 2016 data. So given that China's ocean-centric vision is closely tied up with land financing and political promotion, the coastal regions compete for economic power and international significance by rapidly expanding their territory and build out into the sea. So according to 2012 data, China State Council approved approximately 2,500 square kilometers of the total 5,800 square kilometers of reclamation planned that year, an area approximately 3.5 times that of Singapore. While some reclaimed land, they are intended for agriculture and mariculture, so most of them are allocated for urban, port, and coastal industrial expansion. So the government-sponsored 21st century narrative of China becoming a great sea power is contextualized in several historical stages in this chapter. So understanding these historical stages help to contextualize the rapid and massive scale of land reclamation in China since the early 2000s, and highlights the rationale behind the spatial and temporal reconfiguration of China's Blue National Territory. So that's it. Thank you. I look forward to discussion after everyone's presentation.
Thank you so much, Lu. Lu to Luna. Luna, I think you're muted.
Thank you, Fadi, for the opportunity to share my work. The title of my chapter is Charlottetown's Climate Adaptation, Reclaiming Land from or for Water. I'll walk you through the sections of the presentation. I'll offer some background, and then I'll discuss how land in Charlottetown has typically been reclaimed from water. I'll describe the methodology that I use in my research, and then the design proposals that emerged based on the data collection, which argue for reclaiming land for water. Beginning with the background, when Hurricane Juan hit the maritime provinces in Canada, it caused almost $300 million in damage and led to the loss of 8 lives in these maritime provinces. What also happened is that there were severe impacts on Charlottetown's urban property, but mostly noticeable was the loss to the reclaimed land, the structures that were built on reclaimed land. This drove me to research a little bit more the history of Charlottetown's reclamation. And I noticed that there was more, in addition to land reclamation from the sea, there was also fluvial reclamation, the reclamation of land from urban streams and rivers. That is actually, together with land reclamation, has severely impacted Charlottetown in ways that are unsustainable and lacking in resilience in the age of a climate crisis. So to begin with, fluvial reclamation, Brighton and Charlottetown, as you can see, there's a stream and there's a pond called Government's Pond. This is the area in Charlottetown that's called Brighton. There was a reduction in Governor's Pond area and converting the stream over time. And there was inundation during Hurricane Juan of the reclaimed land during storm events. So my research questions based on these experiences are, how did Charlottetown's land reclamation impact its climate resilience over time? And how can Charlottetown's urban form be adapted to climate change? And what are the lessons that we learned from Charlottetown's land reclamation over time, whether fluvial or coastal? To take you back in history for a bit, just to compare what happened to Charlottetown's land over time, I researched some of the older historic maps dating to 1720 and found that it was originally actually a French military settlement. Then in 1765, it became a colonial capital of the island of St. John, which is now actually Prince Edward Island. In 1771, the first survey of the town was carried out. And as you can see, the shoreline is clearly natural as can be at that time. And you can see the alignment of the parcels and the building footprints that are in harmony with the shoreline. However, over time, so there was consistency of the urban form with the shoreline. And then by 1880, the next historic map shows how severely changed the urban landscape was, particularly by the shoreline, by the coast. By that time, we have 11 wharfs, mostly land reclamation, and we have what is now known in Charlottetown as the 500 lot area, where you have 500 parcels in a gridiron shape. By 1890, the mud in Governor Pond was seen as nuisance, and there were calls by local architects and people to ordinary residents to bury the stream and get rid entirely of the pond. By the 1900s and onward, reclamation accelerates. So the river was buried, completely culverted and buried underground. Governor Pond became paved over, and the topography of the entire landscape, urban landscape, completely changed to accommodate housing and urban development. And the last of these interventions actually happened in 2000, which is the PEI Convention Center, which was built entirely on reclaimed land. So the research methods include design charrettes, interviews with local experts, on-site tours, transect walks, and I'll start with the design charrettes. These were sought to identify the assets, the urban assets in Charlottetown, and identify through the lens of local communities the climate vulnerabilities and what adaptation options can be gleaned from the perspective of the lived experience of local residents. So as you can see, these charrettes, I carried out actually 3. I had a team of 6 students who were involved in all aspects of the charrettes. I use these charrettes, for those who are not familiar what a charrette is, I think focus group, except that we do a lot of drawing and interactive activities using maps and drawings and diagrams. And I did one dedicated to planners and policymakers, attended by around 25 planners, and then 3 that were carried out with various groups of local communities, ordinary people who live and work in Charlottetown. And as you can see, the outcomes of the charrettes include, for example, flip charts, drawings and maps and sketches and post-it notes and so on. So what did the data from these charrettes tell me? These are the kind of diagrams that emerged once we started analyzing those layers of information gleaned from the local communities, identifying the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats. And I won't delve into these. I'd be happy to answer questions at the end, just because I'm trying to be conscious of time. So the next way of collecting data was actually holding interviews with local experts, understanding the history of land reclamation in Charlottetown, understanding what adaptation planning is being carried out at the time. We also carried on-site tours with local experts, whether heritage experts or fisheries and so on. And these experts explained to us the local conditions and the current interventions being carried out at various levels, whether municipal, provincial, or national. We also canvassed the entire city. It's a small city that can be easily walked. And we basically literally walked every street, documented the conditions on the streets and the wharves and so on. These walks also helped us understand the architectural and infrastructural typologies throughout Charlottetown and understand the land uses. So all the data gathered from the charrettes, from our walks and talks and discussions with the experts helped us understand the vulnerability of reclaimed land to climate change. We particularly understood that there were challenges with rising sea levels, with storm surge, with inland inundations from rainfall. Charlottetown also, in case you are not familiar with it, the typology of the soil in Charlottetown is very susceptible to erosion. So as a consequence of rising sea levels, storm surge, and flooding, there is rapid erosion happening throughout the island, not only in Charlottetown. As you can see from this map, the blue shows the flooding and the inundation that takes place when extreme weather events or any actual rainfall events take place in Charlottetown. And they perfectly align with where the stream and the pond used to be and with the land that has been reclaimed over time. The data also that we gathered helped us begin to propose ways to intervene and change the land use and zoning and to adapt through certain modifications and interventions in the urban landscape. So we identified 4 zones depending on the different types of vulnerabilities. So as you can see, there is zone A and zone B, which are mostly built on reclaimed land, and then zones C and D, which struggle with inland inundation when rainfall events happen. And so we identified these intervention zones and identified strategies on integrating blue and green infrastructure, blue and green spaces within the city, and modifying building regulations within Charlottetown to adapt to climate change. All of these measures aim to reclaim land for water, to reverse some of the policies that have taken place over time. One of the primary suggestions that we are proposing is to basically recreate the Governor Pond and deculvert the stream. And this is the existing condition. These are the topography lines, and this is the proposal to reconnect the water and help with flood management, actually, with inland inundation when extreme rainfall events happen. Now they are regretting in Charlottetown the measures taken in the past. We also proposed daylighting the urban stream. The transformation would look something like this. These are the existing conditions. And as you can see, there's a huge parking lot and some government buildings here. And this is the proposal that we are proposing for recreating the pond and the stream that existed. We also are proposing, as I said, to change. So this would be the before and the after as well in the cross section. There would be also a berm that would help with flooding, flood surges during extreme weather events. As for land uses, we also in zones A and B that are more susceptible to flooding, we sought accommodation through zoning recreational uses that facilitate evacuation when needed and minimize the impact on property and livelihoods. As for building regulations, we are proposing that, for example, building measures like building on stilts or using the vertical grain for land uses, putting uses that are not residential on the first floors, so that also we would minimize the loss of life. These are some of the images that show what happens in Zone B, which, as we can see, a lot of residential units are currently zoned there. So in this zone, we are proposing a gradual retreat over time. No one likes to talk about relocation, but what's going on in BC at the moment is a lesson for all of us to begin to have these difficult conversations about the possibility of needing to relocate and retreat from coastal areas where there is threat to lives and livelihoods. So for the future, to facilitate this retreat, the suggestion is to put a moratorium on new development, especially for residential development in these very precarious areas, and to gradually change the land use over time to non-residential uses that are centered around recreation and open green space. We are also, as I said, in these areas that are struggling with a lot of inland flooding to change some of the land uses and to look at the vertical grain of land use to put retail and mixed uses in the first 2 floors and then move the residential to the higher floors. This will help when inundation and flooding take place to protect lives and property. So in reversing reclamation for water instead of from water, there are also other transformations that need to take place in Charlottetown, particularly integrating blue and green infrastructure, BGI, in the urban landscape. We propose several measures in this 2 particular trajectories to intervene in the urban landscape. Our analysis of the urban landscape revealed a lot of what we call druscapes, or landscapes that are hard surfaces, mostly parking lots, sometimes not even parking lots, just hard surfaces, not used by anyone, dead spaces. So all of these can be changed and converted into green spaces. Some of them are functional, like the big pink and orange spot that can be used, for example, during winter for when clearing the snow can be dumped there, but others, the smaller ones that are within the urban landscape, our suggestion is to convert them into green infrastructure. The other approach is one of the things we learned from the local residents is that Charlottetown was rich in bioswales. Actually, there were so many bioswales around the city. And that one mayor, during an election promised to basically convert them into asphalt. And several people confirmed to us through the charrettes and interviews with experts that inland inundations started to get exacerbated once the bioswales went away from the urban landscape. So we proposed to reconnect, create a network of blue and green infrastructure that recreates those bioswales and connects them to 4 primary parks in the city, Rochford, Kings, and Connaught, and Hillsborough Park, where this network of water and green infrastructure would help with permeability, increase the permeability of the urban landscape, and allow the management of rainwater runoff. One of the major problems that Charlottetown also faces nowadays is because of all these hard surfaces and the covering of the bioswales, all the rainwater runoff is running into the sea instead of replenishing the underground aquifer. This is severely impacting the water security during the summer months in Charlottetown. The city faces water shortages, exacerbated also when the big cruise ships come and pump water out of the underground aquifer. So Charlottetown has actually a very precarious water security situation. So our measures seek to create permeability that allow the water to infiltrate back into the soil and replenish the underground aquifer. Thank you, and I look forward for your questions.
Thanks, Luna. Our final speaker for the evening is Michael Wilson. Go ahead, Michael.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you, Fadi and UAT for the opportunity to speak tonight. And this has been very exciting to hear everybody share their chapters in a lot more detail. It's always nice to kind of get the face and voice and hear a different perspective on what we've read. I'm Mike Wilson. I'm actually here in Boston here. And this was based on research looking at Boston's shifting ground that was conducted while at the MIT Department of Urban Studies and Planning. I was there with Fadi and Brent. I'm now currently at the RAND Corporation, still an urban planner, but working more broadly on climate change and equity considerations. I will advance my slide once I find the window there. Okay. Boston, very, whatever, it likes to envision itself as being the hub of the universe, which came to the term from Oliver Wendell Holmes, which is kind of imperious of it, but it is, it has a unique geography that the Massachusetts was actually the tribe that was here, and obviously the name has stuck, and that lived on the Shawmut Peninsula here, which you can see sort of in the middle of the image, near where the pink dot is. That's the State House Dome. Moving in and out of the tidal flats, then rich mud flats, and almost about 2/3 of the city was actually in the littoral gradient, which Fadi explains several times and very well in the book. So I'm not going to try to expand upon that. But the one thing in this image that really strikes me is how much of that water interface has been filled in with logistics, landscapes, park spaces on the positive side. Perhaps for a landscape architect, but also the exaggerated connection of and across the water. With the number of boats is almost impossible, as you can see in the harbor here. The number of train lines shooting across the open water, again, also not correlated to the number of train stations. But this is an emblem of what Boston thought it could be. It was an early environmental pioneer, still is. It had the first environmental law in the US, which prohibited the dumping of animal carcasses. So you had to start somewhere. But the long history and trajectory of Boston gaining ground, as you can see in the magenta dot here, it's just orient, that's the State House, which is sort of the highest point of original land, and Boston Common is in the green there. There's a number of areas where the historic wharfing out, especially up here, sort of in the top middle ground right of the image, which is the South Boston waterfront. And in addition to, let's say, the filling of the Back Bay Flats, this area was also filled in. So we'll advance through the way back machine here to a modern day image. As you can see, it was a logistics space. It's being converted sort of into a more typical post-industrial waterfront. And part of my dissertation and the talk that we'll give tonight is focused on what has become of the South Boston waterfront, and more importantly, what may become of it in the future. So originally a peninsula of almost 600 acres, Boston alone created another 1,000 acres in the South Boston waterfront. So this was very much necessary for its economic expansion and survivability. The pendulum has already begun to shift on this filled land. Sort of Hurricane Sandy was originally a wake-up call for a lot of the cities here in the northeast of the US. In January and March 2018, there was basically two sub 100-year 1% annual exceedance probability storms where it was inundated. Went out there, took some photos. As you can see, the street is closed. It has this sort of almost Venice-like condition as the harbor is, almost incredulously coming across the street. Boston had commissioned some research to understand what is its exposure to this, what is its vulnerability and risks associated with it. And a 36-inch sea level rise scenario, approximately 2070, could inundate up to 11,000 buildings, 70% of which are residential. That translates roughly to an annualized potential loss in 2070 of $1.4 billion a year. But kind of taking a step back from these sort of glossy numbers, if we could imagine this type of storm that happened twice in 1 year, which is probably around a 50-year storm, if you have 3 feet of sea level rise, you're looking at about a $12 billion loss event. This is a major concern for the city. And moving from a wake-up call to a planning process to actually just needing to take action in the very near term. So one of the things that just came out with the historical analysis associated with the dissertation was the very long period of time necessary in order to develop policy around this. And the period of analysis of the dissertation was in this moment from just after Sandy, when there was a flurry of reports that came out, 2-3 years later when Climate Ready Boston was released. Subsequent, and there have been a number of local planning initiatives, coastal resilience design guidelines that have come forth, which is a really exciting opportunity and is going to probably change the course of development and all of these building life cycles that play out into the future. One of the things that I wanted to test in that period of analysis was a mapping change that was done by the federal government as a part of federal emergency management agencies, flood insurance rate map, National Flood Insurance Program. That's the acronyms up at the top there. And this is a participatory mapping process. And as a part of that, there was several different iterations put forth by either the federal contractors or the private consultants hired by the city that sort of pushed and pulled on what this 100-year floodplain looked like. And so if you move from what the map had been in 2009 through to the map, which wound up being in 2015, you see sort of this spike in terms of the amount of land, at least, that's in this area and the number of businesses. The number of residents spiked as well and kind of stayed there. And this is sort of where the city and the federal government kind of came to where risk might be. One of the, there's a great set of articles, and I got to credit Brent for helping me translate this, the all politics have artifacts and artifacts have politics duality. We have the Eddy, which is the sort of developer name for the building up at the top left there, was a new construction about halfway up. It was an existing warehouse from halfway down. The maps were coming out at the time and it was unclear, where new development, 120 feet in the air sat within the floodplain. And to sort of play it safe, they just took the edge of the building that was in the new floodplain out. So that's where you see the sort of little Pac-Man bite that's been taken out. It's a nice architectural reveal, makes an even better story. But at the end of the day, sort of, an artifact of, is this really how we should be managing our flood risk and understanding, where design and development should be going into the future. two of the things I looked at was, two rapidly developing neighborhoods, East Boston and South Boston. South Boston, sort of a national and international scale of investment coming to that area. East Boston, rapidly gentrifying and transitioning, lots of displacement going on, and building out a lot of residential and former industrial and especially contaminated environmental justice type landscapes. Wanted to understand whether there's two different things going on, because visually at least there was. And what I used was a developer checklist to survey out of 100 projects that were going through the development agency at the time, the 50 that were in the future sea level rise hazard area, and compare sort of about 20 of them that were in these neighborhoods. Statistically significant findings were that they had entirely different groups of climate experts using entirely different sets of assumptions, absent guidance from the city. The ones in East Boston were also more likely to be in the VE zone, which is the wave action zone, loosely speaking. And they basically understood this to be a much riskier area. So there was a lot more hardening that took place. They assumed a less likelihood of future map changes, and because they sort of overshot the freeboard and other risk tolerances they built into their projects. And they also put in fewer generators. So there's, one of the things is that they did hard flood proofing rather than sort of hoping for a little bit of a softer approach that South Boston went with. In terms of when there was a shift in the mapping process that went on, the developers actually did respond, which was obviously good news in terms of that there are more maps coming out, and does the community understand when risk, at least on paper, changes, that their projects must necessarily also change. So the map change was associated with moving away from residential land use, and also it might be concomitant with that there's fewer below grade stories associated with parking. The different climate experts actually kind of stayed, which is interesting as well. That this is, it seems to be a steady trend, and that the developers actually then embraced even higher level sea level rise assumptions. They expected even longer periods of inundation, and they started putting more flexibility for adaptation into their buildings. So all of this was pointing towards more resilience. As a part of this, I built out a flood risk model, and about 80% of the estimated future losses because of this map change were potentially, quote unquote, avoided, given the changes in the developer actions. And about 15% wound up being there because of kind of prods and pushes from the city in terms of its guidance and guidelines associated with urban design. So there was only about out of an original pile of about $1.5 billion worth of aggregate flood risk over the next until 2050, there was only about 150 million remaining after the sort of this push and prod process. In East Boston, there's this tablet there that is a quote from Urban Planner, and it's, a city is not an accident, which is kind of a fun reflection on this. But as a part of the far off threats, how do you shift these baselines? And the chapter goes into a lot more explanation of that. But trying to understand what is the cumulative probability of risk, and that basically we were always sort of tracing out the discrete increment underneath a curve, necessarily then deviating from that natural curve. So our systems have a very hard time keeping up with natural processes. On the other side of that tablet, it says, city's not but an accident, but the result of coherent visions and aims. And I think that's sort of a hopeful way to, sort of at least go into the discussion here. Boston does have a tradition of environmental and climate leadership, but, like many cities, is reluctant to, spends a lot of time reflecting on the history, but reluctant to move into the future. That may be changing given that we've had several mayors and a new mayor as of Tuesday. Extensive stakeholder consultation and professional visiting did improve outcomes, and demonstrably improved outcomes, with statistical significance, which is always very exciting that we can point to this as a worthwhile enterprise. And planning is a contested process. and it takes a very long time to develop, finance, and implement plans. So understanding what those increments are when they fall upon these dynamic curves and changes that we're facing, is very helpful for the developers and also their architectural engineering consultants that help support their plan making and the cities that they build and design and develop. So thank you for the opportunity to speak. I see Brent is now on video, and I will pass the mic over to him and Fadi. Thank you.
Over to you, Brent.
Thank you, Fadi, and thanks to all of the presenters tonight for very stimulating presentations and for your contributions to the book, which will make your thoughts lasting. I'm expecting a wide audience for all of your thoughts in the book that is just being published. So my time with you is short. I want to provide a few points for reflection that could stimulate further thought or even relate to questions, assuming we have time for a couple of those. We began with Fadi Massoud, who alerted us to the fact that we humans are the most significant agents of global transformation here at the level of the archaeosphere. In other words, the land-water interface at the surface of the earth shaped by humanity. And Fadi, the importance of the book, of course, is showing us that the pace and scale and ubiquity of this transformation is unprecedented. It's closely linked to material commodity exchanges. In other words, the book reminds us that this is a phenomenon that urbanists should be paying very close attention to. And I think Terra-Sorta-Firma is a really valuable step in that direction. Ben Mendelsohn took a cultural turn and reminded us that other paradigms are needed and valuable to interpret landmaking in Lagos, not just as spectacular and to some extent hackneyed binaries between rich and poor, indigenous and foreign, past and present, Africa and everybody else, but maybe simply as an episode in a longer history of regulating sedimentary dynamics, as he termed it, but also an exchange between Africa and the larger world, an exchange which Africa has led quite often, as we are increasingly learning and giving credit to in our new historiography of Africa. Liu Xiaoxuan discussed, I think quite poetically, the tactile reality of the transition between land and water, and back again in Bohai Bay when she found that technological tools showed her to be on land around water, when in reality she was on land. So even the omniscient technological tools of Google are behind the land making transition in China. And she reminded us that this is a transition not only with poetic dimensions, but with historical and even geopolitical legacies, and very, very consciously part of an activity today that constitutes a new imagination of China as a maritime power, an imagination which is of great interest, of course, in contemporary China. Luna Hirfan shared the experience of Charlottetown, PEI, a city that we may think of as small, and I liked your story of being able to walk around it so easily, but a city that itself is engaged in quite a lot of oceanic, but also fluvial reclamation, and thank you for highlighting fluvial reclamation, in which you called out very quickly as unsustainable in our age of climate crisis, and I think that's something we really need to pay attention to. Luna called not only for additional resilience, but she highlighted how community design charrettes can capture valuable lived experiences from those who live and work in these places that lead us toward a more perhaps participatory and equitable approach to adaptation planning than we saw in the previous two cases. And in conclusion, Mike Wilson discussed what I think of as the near canonical story of Boston's land making, perhaps the best researched of all cities' land making processes, but one in which the fact that the made land is mostly logistics landscapes is little discussed, perhaps because those landscapes are not quite as aesthetically pleasing to us as the Back Bay, but they constitute probably 80%, I'm guessing, of the made land of Boston. And Mike also points out that the pendulum is already shifting, a very uncomfortable reality for us. And the raw numbers alone should inspire some very serious concern. And I'm sure that that's one of the perspectives you're bringing to RAND. But also you highlight that Boston's tradition of innovation can hold some promise. So in conclusion, the reclaiming of the littoral gradient, we see it as part and parcel of city making. It's part and parcel of human culture. To some extent, it's therefore necessary and valuable. but it's also a reminder of the environmental change that we're bringing to the planet. And it's a change that our generation is bringing to extremes, and the sustainability of which, of course, is highly and troublingly uncertain. In other words, how we feel about land making may reflect how optimistic we feel about humanity overall. That being said, I want to call our attention to what I called in my foreword a possible semiotic transition from sinner to savior, as I called it, as land making ceases to perhaps be a violation of nature and instead becomes our shelter from an angry nature, from the rising seas that we ourselves are causing very actively. Even as we speak here tonight, the temperature is increasing. So I think this transition is only beginning, and the progress and potential of land making from damage to shelter might be hotly debated. So in closing, our guests have very helpfully reminded us that we can appreciate land making for its role in culture, urbanization, let us not forget design, yet remain extremely cautious about the damage it's inflicting and call for the reclaiming of the littoral gradient to undergo further transformation from destroyer of nature to the rescuer of our increasingly vulnerable cities. Thank you very much. And over to you, Fadi, to field a couple of questions if we have time.
And thank you so much. That was incredibly eloquent, very helpful, very powerful, and really just so on point. So couldn't ask for a better set of remarks from your end. I have a question here from Professor Nina Marie Lister at the Ryerson University's School of Urban Regional Planning. And she asks, she says, thank you for such a compelling book and presentations of dissolving binaries and littoral gradients. Can you perhaps expand on how this translates to zoning and say a bit about the need for a different, less static approach to how we zone for change? Thanks and congrats. So I think that's a really wonderful question that probably would need its own new conference and next book. As you all know, I'm obsessed with this topic. So thank you, Nina Marie, for bringing it up. I mean, I'm in the presence of Brent, who speaks about policies, so I don't want to make anything wrong. But I think what is really critical is if we just even trace back the history of normative zoning, it was based on this idea that there is a static permanence, there is a highest and best use, and there is this sort of ultimate thing that we need to reach, that once we reach, it stays in place, we protect it. You know, in many cities, that manifests as single family residential. We're living through the time where all of these kind of conventions are actually doing the opposite. They're hindering innovation. They're enabling the status quo. They're perpetuating it more and more. So all the tools, I think, need to be up in the air, right? You know, zoning, built form, parks, infrastructure, and that answer, today's event was really about showing the global extent of this, and that these tools, unlike how at some point we're seen as ubiquitous and could be everywhere at the same time and be translated in an equal way, that we need to really think of hyper-local and hyper-specific and hyper-contextual solutions for hyper-local and hyper-contextual problems. So I think the zoning that the Euclidean method that just somehow means residential everywhere on the planet should just be thrown out the window and rethought. So thanks for that question, Nina Marie. I hope we can convene on that topic again sometime in the future. I just want to, you know, in the last 3-4 minutes we have, open it up for anyone else who might have questions or want to add to the discussion.
If you don't mind, I'd like to maybe a quick address that question, because it's a great question, because it allows us to think about how these type of research translate to the practice of the city, whether it's today or going forward. One thing that I've been thinking about that question is really, you know, in our urban planning policies and thinking, there is this assumption that land is either water or solid. So I would say that, you know, to that great question is that it is recognizing the importance of the in-between. It's recognizing that there are ecological and otherwise, perhaps, but cultural and definitely environmental values to neither land nor water. And that, I think, underwrites, I believe, the importance of this book that you all have created, it's to recognize that so much of city making in the past century has been trying, not necessarily reclaiming water, a lot of it's reclaiming the zones in between, whether it's wetland, estuary, what have you. And those are such important zones, whether we're talking about climate change, or we're talking about biodiversity. So for me, one of the immediate actions for anyone who is in the urban policy practice either in Toronto or around the world is to advocate to a nuanced approach when it comes to land policy, to recognize and plan for and accommodate the land in between, and recognizing the important programs, whether it is flora and fauna or people, aquaculture, what have you, in those zones. So again, I had wanted to chime in on this because I do think that very often a book like this and these really important historical and visual and spatial research, there is this tendency for people to say, well, how does this translate into what we do? How does this translate to real life? How does this translate into the practice? And for me, that's where I see the value of that.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're reaching 8 o'clock. Thank you for that excellent concluding thought, Dean Du. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I just wanted to point your attention to our next event, which is titled Listening Out of Place, From Ecotectonics to Acoustic Space, with Joseph Clark and moderated by Mitchell Akayama, which is coming up next Tuesday, November 23rd at 12 p.m. Eastern. Thank you to Nini and to Tim and to the entire staff at Daniels for making this smooth and exciting and seamless. Much appreciated. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. Take care.